it has started. So this is Du Bois, Dark Water right here, and then the Souls of White Folk. Okay, so I need to switch my screen. Sorry, everyone. Okay, so this is the Souls of White Folk. Now, one of the things about, I think you'll actually find it easier to decipher the social, like Durkheim's theory of the social world, because he goes through a lot more systematically and says, this is how I define social facts. This is how I define religion. This is how he makes definitions, whereas Du Bois is much more narrative like and much more poetic in how he writes. And so sometimes it's hard to say, oh, this is what he's trying to say, or oh, this is an important part. So that is something unique to Du Bois. And we'll also get a little bit of that in Cooper. Anna Cooper is also, she likes to, she throws in a lot of religious metaphors and things like that. So sometimes it's hard to come out. So just know that you're not the only one. That is not uncommon. So,
Okay.
but let me see, where is this that I wanted to? Okay, so let's just start from the beginning. If if it's hard for you to read, let me post this link in the chat. That way people can follow along as well. Okay, so it starts out again. It's not academic at all. High in the tower where I sit above the loud complaining of the human sea, I know many souls that toss and whirl and pass, but none there are that intrigue me more than the souls of white folk. Of them I am singularly clairvoyant. I see in and through them. I view them from unusual points of vantage. Not as a foreigner do I come, for I am native, not foreign, bone of their thoughts and flesh of their language. Mine is not the knowledge of the traveler or the colonial composite of dear memories, nor yet is my knowledge that which servants have of masters, or mass of class, or capitalists of artisan. Rather, I see these souls undressed and from the back and side. I see the working of their entrails. I know their thoughts, and they know that I know. That knowledge makes them now embarrassed, now furious. So he starts out by saying, from my vantage point, I can understand the very essence of white folks. I see all that they have done in terms of power. So uh, this where he says, rather I see these souls undressed, and from the back inside I see the working of their entrails. I know their thoughts, and they know that I know. He's really just trying to show, I and it makes more sense having read the Souls of Black Folk. Why is that we know from Du Bois's perspective that those who are marginalized are able to see better than those who are in power, and that's kind of what he's saying now. Is I can see through you. I can see everything that's going on. The discovery of personal whiteness among the world's peoples is a very modern thing. Um, let's see. I wanted to get. So the assumption that of all the hues of God, whiteness alone is inherently and obviously better than brownness or tan leads to curious acts. So the idea that white folk are better than anyone else is weird and leads to people to do weird things. Even the sweeter souls of the dominant world, as they discourse with me on weather, weal, and woe, are continually playing above their actual words an obligato of tune and tone, saying. So when he says even above, when they chat with me about the weather, there's something above that's kind of going on and behind, and it's something like, my poor unwhite thing, weep not nor rage. I know too well that the curse of God lies heavy on you. Why, that is not for me to be saved, but be brave. Do your work in your lowly sphere, praying the Lord God into heaven above, where all is love, you may one day be born white. So he's saying that in the back of their minds, they're kind of just saying it. That sucks to not be white. Maybe someday God will work it out. And my response is, but what on earth is whiteness that one should desire it? And he goes then from like the step by which the white race started categorizing by color and then started believing that there was a hierarchy. So now, what is the effect on a man or nation when it comes passionately to believe such an extraordinary dictum as this? That nations are coming to believe its manifest daily, wave on wave, each with increasing virulence is dashing this new religion of whiteness on the shores of our time. Its first effects, so right here we see that he's going to start, giving us a list of effects. The first effects are funny, meaning the first effects of seeing oneself as white, the strut of the southerner, the arrogance of the Englishman amok, the whoop of the hoodlum who vicariously leads your mob. Next, so this is the second effect, it appears dampening generous enthusiasm in what we once counted glorious. To free the slave is to be discovered tolerable only insofar as it freed its master. Do we sense solemn writhings in Black Africa, or angry groans in India, or triumphant banzais in Japan? These, to your tent sows Israel, these nations are not white. So he's saying it's only, to free the slave is only good if it is benefiting the white folk. So they don't care about what's happening in Africa or India or in Japan, because that hasn't benefited the white folk yet, but the freeing of the slave is something that they needed to do, and they had to do it, and so now they're counting themselves benevolent. After the more comic manifestations and chilling of generous enthusiasm come subtler and darker deeds. So this is number 3. Everything considered, the title to the universe claimed by white folk is faulty. So he's saying here that white folk are claiming that they own the world, that they are the prime people. They are the title to the universe. How easy then, by emphasis and omission, to make children believe that every great soul the world ever saw was a white man's soul, that every great thought the world ever knew was a white man's thought, that every great deed the world ever did was a white man's deed, etc. So attributing all that is great to white folk. And this is something we see today when you argue that slavery was bad. A lot of people will say, well, what did Africa ever give to the world? All of advancements came from Europe, which is demonstrably untrue. But that's what Du Bois is trying to say is common, is that white folk try to claim everything that is good. In fine, that if from the world were dropped everything that could not fairly be attributed to white folk, the world would, if anything, be greater, truer, better than now. And if all of this be a lie, is it not a lie and a great cause? And here it comes that the comedy verges to tragedy. So, number 4, the first minor note is struck all unconsciously by those worthy souls in whom consciousness of high descent brings burning desire to spread the gift of abroad, the obligation of the nobility to the ignoble. He's talking about the idea that they should go forth and make the world better, is where the comedy of whiteness becomes a tragedy. Such a sense of duty assumes 2 things: a real possession of the heritage and the frank appreciation by the humble born. So long then as humble black folk, voluble with thanks, receive barrels of old clothes from lordly and generous whites, there is much mental peace and moral satisfaction. So these white folk go around, they donate their old clothes, they give, the crumbs from the table, and they are looking for just adulation and praise from people who aren't white to say, thank you, how blessed are we that you came. But when the black man begins to dispute the white man's title to certain alleged bequests of the fathers in wage and position, authority and training, and when his attitude toward charity is sullen, angry rather than thumbs humble jollity when he insists on his human right to swagger and swear and waste. So why can't the black man say, it is my human right not to be like you? Whether that's good or bad, I don't have to follow your footsteps. Then the spell is suddenly broken, and the philanthropist is ready to believe that Negroes are impudent, that the South is right, and that Japan wants to fight America. And then finally, after this, the descent into hell is easy. And this is where I was arguing there was kind of the psychological effects of white people, of their whiteness.
Mhm.
On the pale white faces which the great billows whirl upward toward my tower, I see again and again, often and still more often, a writing of human hatred, a deep and passionate hatred, vast by the very vagueness of its expression. Down through the green waters, on the bottom of the world, where men move to and fro, I have seen a man, an educated man, grow livid with anger because a little silent black woman was sitting by herself in a Pullman car. He was a white man. I have seen a great grown man curse a little child who had wandered into the wrong waiting room, searching for its mother. Here, you dang black, he was white. In Central Park, I've seen the upper lip of a quiet, peaceful man curl back its tigerish snarl of rage because a black folk rode by in a motor car. He was a white man. We have seen you and I, city after city, drunk and furious with ungovernable lust of blood, mad with murder, destroying, killing, and cursing, torturing human victims because somebody accused of crime happened to be of the same color as the mob's innocent victims, and because that color was not white. We have seen, merciful God, in these wild days and in the name of civilization, justice, and motherhood, what we have not seen right here in America of orgy, cruelty, barbarism, and murder done to men and women of Negro descent. So he's saying that as we have, from the beginning, when we create this category of whiteness, first they feel a little bit pumped up, like he says, the swagger or the strut of the Southerner. Then it gets a little bit comical in the terms of like they think that everything is from them. They think that they're the God's gift to humanity. Then they start doing this charitable acts, and unless people in poverty or who aren't white like give them all the flowers and thank yous and you're amazing, then they start growing in hatred. And once they've grown in hatred, they just become sick people. They become just so consumed with hate that they just have to act in violence. And he ends with all of the things that white America has done of orgy, cruelty, barbarism, and murder. And so it's just festered, this hatred of others has festered inside whiteness that they can't but help respond to the world with hatred. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And then this is the quote I just, and John Z, I think this is a perfect quote for your study. Um, Am I in my blackness the sole sufferer? I suffer, and yet somehow above the suffering, above the shackled anger that beats the bars, above the hurt that crazes, there surges in me a vast pity. A pity for people imprisoned and enthralled, hampered and made miserable for such a cause, for such a fantasy. So white people are
I
in
agree.
their minds imprisoned because of their hatred towards people of color.
Mhm.
So again, this is like a psychological prison that he views them under. I don't know if reading that together helped you see kind of how I'm thinking through his words.
Yes, most definitely.
So and I again, I understand that Du Bois is difficult because he writes more poetically, right?
Mhm.
I mean, this whole paragraph where he's talking about the tigerish snarl, is very
Mhm.
colorful. What helps me is looking for keywords that signify something important. The first one I noticed was where he says its first effects. Anytime there's a list or they say things like first or next or and then, that's a key for your brain to be like, okay, they're talking about like a process here.
Hmm.
What is that process? So its first effects, I would say, wait, what are we talking about? What is its? And then I would go back and I would see that he's talking about whiteness. So
Yeah.
whiteness's first effects are funny. Okay, so since he's talking about whiteness, here's the first. Let me find the second. Next, it gives me the key word. So look for those like signifiers, and that helps
Okay.
you tease apart the different aspects of the theory they're bringing in, and that gives
Mhm.
it more of a systematic read. That's what I would suggest.
Okay.
Um, but as always, and I would suggest this to you and to everyone else on the call, if you've ever read a piece or a segment from the reading and you are like, come away and you're like, what did I just read? Feel free to email me and I'm happy
Hmm.
to like give you, like, help you find those signposts like that to say, okay, focus
Okay.
on here's the paragraph where he's going to talk about this. Look for the words, its first effects, and that's your signpost or something like that. And I'm happy to kind of help you find those specific parts. I know
Okay.
it is difficult. You're not alone. um,
Okay.
People who were reading in the not the 1850s, in the 1950s would have picked up on this a lot easier than we do because this was more of a common way of writing back then, whereas
Mhm.
today scientific writing is very dry and very logical and matter of fact, so we're not
Yeah.
used to something like this. um, which makes it, I mean, on one hand it's interesting and beautiful, but on the other hand it's hard to read.
Hmm.
So any other questions or thoughts?
No, not for me.
Okay. And again, and feel free to bring, readings into office hours. Like if you want, if you or if you know there's a time where you are reading and you would like me to be quote unquote on call,
Hmm.
like you can email me and say, I'm doing my reading from 3 to 5 p.m. on Friday. Is there any way you could be near your email so that I could just pepper you with questions as I read this? I can do that too. Um,
Okay.
so or yeah, just so that you can always in real time be able to get some feedback so you're not like waiting on me. Um, but feel free to use me as a resource as you go. I know that the reading guides might give you ideas, but it's not like actually helping you pull everything out. And so I'm happy to
Yeah.
make that happen.
Okay. Thank you.
Hmm. Anyone else have anything you want me to cover before we go into Durkheim? Okay. I am actually, as I was preparing this, I realized how excited I was about Durkheim. He used to be my least favorite to read. For whatever reason, I really enjoyed rereading him. Um, so hopefully this is as fun for you as for me. I think this gives a really good glance, even though, so today, very few sociologists and anthropologists like grapple with Durkheim. They might cite him and say, as we know from Durkheim, but they don't like try to engage with his work. And part of that is because he really laid the foundation for what sociology is. And we've accepted a lot of these tenets without, um, we don't question them anymore. So Emile Durkheim, um, as you might have already seen in the reading guide, he was a French sociologist and is credited largely with formally establishing sociology as a discipline. There were technically, if we want to get really technical and like more global, we can trace the first sociologist probably to I think it's Iran in the 1300s. His name is Ibn uh, Kasnut. It's IBN, and then the last name starts with K. If people are interested in his work, I can send it to you. In Europe, the first time sociology was written was by Augustus Comte, Comte. Um, he was a little crazy and hard for a lot of people to understand, and he never really set any like institutions of sociology, whereas Durkheim did. So Durkheim created the first social science course in France. He introduced the first social science curriculum in the French, K through 12 equivalent. He founded the first sociology journal in France, which was the first social science journal. And he kind of made sociology a credible field of study. Interestingly, he says he is not the first sociologist and gives that credit to Adam Smith. If you're familiar with Adam Smith, he's the one who wrote about the invisible hand as and talks about market forces and economics. Emile Durkheim says he's more of the first sociologist because he was talking about how there is something outside of groups of individuals called society that affected us. And that's what Emile Durkheim is really trying to push, is that there is something outside of us that does influence us. And we'll get to that in a second. So a reminder that Durkheim is pretty different in terms of how he envisions sociology from Weber. Weber wanted to look at the possibility of human agency, whereas Durkheim wanted to focus on what are the laws that govern human action and that can help us understand all of the mechanisms of human society. So Durkheim really saw sociology as a science just like chemistry, that if we understand the laws, then we'll understand how humans work. And we'll be able to, predict all of the different actions humans would make as long as we understand those laws. So, what is it that sociologists study? If physicists study the atom and chemists study chemical bonds, what is it that sociologists study? We study social facts. A social fact for Durkheim is every way of acting, thinking, and feeling, fixed or not, capable of exercising external constraint on the individual. In other words, it is that which is general in the whole society, independent from individual manifestations. What to pull from that is that there are three key aspects of social facts as an object of study. A, it's ways of acting, thinking, and feeling that are collective and general in a society. So it's not just what I myself do, think, or act. It exists outside of the individual. This means that that way of acting, thinking, or feeling was not created by you and will not end when you die or stop doing it. A great example of this is language. No one in this class came up with English, yet we all speak it. When we die, English will not suddenly disappear. It will continue to be spoken. So it is a way of both thinking and acting, our speech, that exists outside of us because we did not ourselves create it, right? And then finally, it constrains us or affects us in some way. This is the incorrect. I did this in my other class too. It should be an A. It affects us rather than effects us. So by constrain, he means that it pushes us to act in that specific way, the social fact. So living in America, the social fact of the English language pushes us to speak that language. Even if we're from France or from Nicaragua or from India, when we come to the US, because it is a social fact to speak English, we are pushed into speaking it regardless of our ability, right? It is something that pushes us to do this thing. Social facts can be anything from, social, like really loose social norms, like holding the door open for someone, right? That's something we do. It's a norm that I didn't start, you didn't start. Yet when I see someone behind me coming up to the door after I've reached it, I have this impulse to hold the door open for them, right? It's constraining or affecting me to do that action. If I instead am like thinking in my head, No, I'm just going to let the door slam behind me. I can feel a discomfort because I am going against the social norm. Durkheim argues that we recognize social facts best when we try to go against that constraint. And the best way I can explain or like describe that is when you're running with the wind, you don't notice that the wind is on your back, right? Because you're going with it at the same speed. But when you turn around and try to walk against the wind, that's when you feel the wind and you know that the wind exists. Same thing with social facts. When we are actively following social facts, we hardly notice them. Getting dressed in the morning, brushing our teeth, driving on the right side of the road, speaking English. But when we start moving against social facts, if I started to go to my work nude, if I started driving on the left side of the road, if I started speaking to you all in Italian, then all of us would start to feel uncomfortable. We would start to feel like something was wrong. And that is, for Durkheim, a demonstration of the social facts' power over us. That it's making us, it's so uncomfortable that we will want to stop going against social norms and do what we're supposed to. Are there any questions on social facts based on what I just discussed?
No.
Professor, can I ask you, can
Please.
I ask a question about a present day
Yeah.
thing in terms of social facts? I'm thinking about it in terms of the present war that's going on with Russia and Ukraine.
Yep.
And I'm wondering if the response of the world to one side or the other, uh, can that explain how social facts work too? When
So,
we
what would be the way of acting, thinking, or feeling that is common?
to 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 um to respect the sovereignty of a given area or space,
Hmm.
even a person's space, is I see it as a social fact, I think.
I agree. I
Am I
think,
understanding that right?
yeah. So Putin definitely violated an international norm of the respect of sovereignty in his action. I think the Western powers specifically are torn between two social norms. One of them is respecting sovereignty. The other is doing everything we can to avoid a nuclear war. Um,
Yes.
right? So they're trying to protect Ukraine as much as possible without actually declaring war on Russia because of the fear of starting that nuclear war. So they're fighting between two competing international norms, and that's how I would imagine it. Does that help
Okay.
make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah. So we could think again. So the protecting sovereignty, the protecting of sovereign nations, um, as a norm, is a way of acting. It's also a way of thinking, right? The whole idea that we should protect sovereign nations. It exists outside of the individual because none of us came up with that idea. It probably originated, you know, in the 1970s or 80s, that as the USSR was crumbling, that we should protect, the smaller states that come out of it. And it constrains us to act in certain ways or to do those kind of protections of the Ukraine. Any other questions? Okay, so he does make a little bit of a distinction between social facts and social currents. Social currents are um, uh, ways of thinking, acting, or feeling that just haven't become crystallized into um, coercing us repeatedly. So this might be something like going to a Black Lives Matter rally and starting to chant, this is what democracy looks like. And we are all caught up in the feeling and emotion that this is what democracy looks like, that we start chanting, we're in it. But then once the movement is over, we're not going home chanting this is what democracy looks like, right? It's not something we continue to do. That's a social current. It's something that in particular moments affects us, constrains us, gets us to start acting or believing or feeling in certain ways. But once that context ends, that norm kind of falls away. So a social fact is when a social current has crystallized such that no matter the context, we are engaging in that social fact. I'm trying to think of an example of something that might have crystallized more. Uh, Acceptance of gay marriage. That is a social fact that changed drastically within the last 20 years, right? So before Obama, the majority of people in the U.S. did not agree that LGBT folks should be able to marry members of the same sex. And maybe in like small pockets, there might have been that belief, there might have been that idea, but within the last 10, 15 years, public opinion on that has swayed. So now the way of thinking or believing that is a social fact is whoever wants to be married should be able to get married. So that would be an example of crystallization. This is very similar to Weber's rational or routinization or regularities of social action, right? So he was talking about how social actions that become regular and the meaning is shared between people such that, it becomes a routine in our daily lives. That's something similar in that here is a passing norm through this group, but over time we keep doing it, we keep doing it, we keep doing it until it's become a social fact. Any questions on social facts and social currents? Okay. So next we move into his idea of functionalism and normality. This helps us explain how he sees society as a kind of as a entity unto itself. So we talked already about social facts, how those are something outside of us, how those constrain us. But now he's going to talk about how social facts are a thing of society that is an object outside of us. But he also, in this discussion, will show what is the sociologist's role in civic life. How should the sociologist be engaged in the world based on our understanding of society and social facts? So here is a quote that is describing how you understand what a healthy society is. He says, health is that state in which our chances of survival are the greatest. Those facts which appear common among a society, we shall call normal. And he goes on to say, he says, for example, he says that not everything, this isn't healthy in terms of what we see as, what's the word? Biological, like individual sickness. He's saying that health is something that is normal. For example, old age is normal and dying from old age is normal. He says that if someone didn't age, that would actually signify something is wrong. Similarly, he says menstruation is normal. We often think of it as this problem, but since it happens to every woman, well, not every woman, but the large majority of women, and it's repeated. And if a 20-year-old woman was not menstruating, then that would be abnormal. That would be a problem. So something is normal or something is healthy if it is normal. And he says here at the bottom of this quote, why is the normal considered healthy? It would be surprising if the most widespread phenomena were not beneficial, at least at the aggregate level. Why else would they exist and persist for so long? So let's take the idea of language, for example. he would say the English language is normal and healthy because if it wasn't, then why does it exist? Why would people still be speaking English if it was a totally dysfunctional language? So, social facts are normal as long as they are common, long-lasting, and widespread. They are normal elements because they must be beneficial in some way to society. Notice that because we're talking about society as the entity, we're not talking about whether this is beneficial for humans. We're talking about whether this upholds the current social norms and the societal arrangements. So we could think of many things that are unhealthy to humans, but are healthy to society. For example, the current way that we have an obsession with employment and work, this glorification of always working, that is unhealthy. It is causing a wide variety of biologically unhealthy problems like bad backs, stress, anxiety, depression, burnout, etc. However, because our society right now is a capitalist society that requires profit and growth, then the tendency to glorify working and working your hardest and your longest is functional for that society to exist and perpetuate. So social facts are functional in some way to society, and sociologists' job is to simply point out how social facts are functional. What kind of society are they upholding, and is that the society that we want? He's going to argue we shouldn't be involved in good versus bad, simply talking about what social facts or why social facts are helping society. Does that make sense? Are there any questions? In this piece, he goes through and he talks about crime as an example of a normal, functional social fact. Now, before we get into this, this is one of the hardest things for students to wrap their head around because we have been so inundated with a definition of crime as something that breaks the law. And he is arguing that we need to think of crime as something different. So he starts out by saying crime is something that offends our individual and collective notions about what is right. So for Durkheim, crime is any deviation from social facts. So if when I walk into an elevator, instead of turning around to look at the doors, I stay facing everyone else, I have committed a crime because I've deviated from our social norms. Now, crimes can be as innocent or as non-threatening or damaging as that example of standing and looking at the people in the elevator, or it can be as serious and as important to a society that they have written it down in law and will even sentence you to death if you break that collective notion. However, there is nothing inherently different about the collective notion that you should face an elevator door than the collective notion that you shouldn't murder someone. Both of those are collective notions about what is right. It is just that one is more strongly held to the point that we have codified it in law. So he would argue that we assign the greatest penalties to the things that are the most dearly held beliefs about what is right, and the penalty of breaking those norms. Now, how would crime then be something normal or functional? He says to have no crime means that every person would agree what those notions are. So that every person would agree on the social facts. And he says that seems impossible. Humans are prone to deviate. It would also mean that nothing would ever change because no one would be doing anything against the collective will. To have no crime means we would have no originality, no thinking against the herd, and we must all have some of this because nothing is good at all times without limits. Sometimes, too, the crimes of today prepare the way for the moralities of the future. Can someone give me an example of a crime that has paved the way for the morality of today?
I was actually going to ask you about that particular line.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about, well, I'm thinking about many things, but one thing I could think about is when we talk about, for instance, the argument of Black Lives Matter and how they've talked about or have watched um, what this definition would say are crimes against or definitely offensive things towards individuals and the collective, um, but yet it doesn't seem to go or hasn't seemed to go far enough in correcting it. So to me, that that seems to suggest that we should be mindful of how that would affect the morality of our future.
Can you give, so you're saying that Black Lives Matter has yet to turn its beliefs into a social fact, but
I think
that's,
they're I think they're close.
yeah, okay.
I see some evidence of that. But what I'm saying is, be, if I just think about it and in this very moment, until we begin to see much more change in that area, if I just think about it for this moment, it makes it so much more important in my mind
Mm-hmm.
that those things be addressed collectively so as not to uh, affect the morality of our future as a
Yeah.
society.
I think so that we need to keep pushing, so we need to keep pushing forward to make sure we don't lose this for our future morality.
Yes. I'm
Yes.
wondering if that's kind of where he's headed with that statement.
Yeah, so just to give an example of something that is already happened, the civil rights era, the um, what's it called? I mean, all of them engaged in civil disobedience and broke the law repeatedly. But today, it is the today's morality is that segregation is bad, right? um, it is. While there are
Yeah.
always going to be people who say something absurd like we should resegregate, the majority of Americans will agree that segregation is bad. So the civil rights activists engaged in crime, and that prepared the way for the morality of segregation being bad today. We could also think about the Bernie Sanders and um, the Occupy Wall Street movement. For those who haven't been as politically, in tune since 2000, what was that, 2007 or 2008 during the financial crisis, there was very few times that we talked about the 1% in American society, or we talked about, the richest of the rich or Wall Street before the 2008 Occupy Wall Street and Bernie Sanders really railing on this massive amount of wealth that the top 1% hoard. But today, that has become a norm of discussion, and an immoral social fact of the United States that even some Republicans say that's improper. So that's another example of the crime of occupying this entire area illegally, prepared a way for a new morality of today. And I think what John C. is getting at is that we are living in a social upheaval today where people are committing crimes, pushing for a new morality. Um, so the riots, the protests, and I would even, this is controversial, but I will say even the looting is part of this push for a new morality. And I would say that it's already created a lot of changes because, 10 years ago, if you told someone that you wanted to defund police departments, you would be seen as crazy. It's like spouting nonsense, we should put you in a institution. But today, defund the police is a legitimate public discourse. It's a legitimate idea. Um, and if I'm correct in what you were trying to say, John Z, you're saying not just about defund the police, but in general about how we, look at the criminal justice system and equal rights, is that we are in a moment that we must keep pressing. Otherwise, we might lose the opportunity to ensure that this is a future morality.
I'm actually saying both things. I'm saying what you're saying because I see evidence of those things, but I am
Right.
also saying that based on what Durkheim is saying here, it could work even in the opposite. That if crimes or those things that offend our individual and collective notions go unanswered, like we just don't we
Mhm.
let these things happen, we don't say anything about them, they're wrong and we know it, but we don't say anything. That can change our morality of the future as well, in my mind,
I
the
see.
way I'm
Yes.
reading this.
So the lack of social control, uh,
Yes.
and I think you're right, and I think we're seeing that in terms of the, like, let's take for example, how common it is for senators in on Twitter to like say disgusting things about each other, right? There's been very little social control on saying stop. The senators are supposed to be above all this, They're supposed to be the respectable politicians. Um, but there hasn't been any social control to make them stop. And so it's become the morality to just, trash whoever you want, regardless of your political position, regardless of how esteemed you're supposed to be. So I think that's right. And we could go into a lot of examples about the current political status today and what the lack of social control has contributed to the morality that we're living in. So let's quickly go through. So crime, as a definition, is when someone breaks social norms. It's functional because we can find it in every society. So remember, that is something that is healthy, is if you can find it everywhere. It reinforces social norms because it gives the opportunity for people to enact social control. It allows people to say, no, we want this social fact. It is good to wear clothes. Please stop coming to work naked. And it provides the means for social change because if enough people come to work naked, then hey, maybe nudity will prevail. I don't know. I'm not a nudist. I'm just trying to that's just a funny example. But we could imagine that if enough people were pushing for nudity, that it could take, a movement to say, maybe we shouldn't care about how people look without clothes. So let's just accept that people can walk around naked, right? That is a potential possibility. Any questions on this? Okay. So, religion as society. This is one of my favorite things to talk about Durkheim. I did it in the intro to sociology class today. Um, I asked them, and so I'm going to ask you, what is similar between the Chicago Bears as a sports team and, let's say, um, the Catholic religion? What is similar between the Chicago Bears and Catholicism?
I don't know. I'd say like the loyal fans or the loyal.
So
I just
loyal?
like just they just both have loyal.
Hmm.
I don't know, congregants, fans, I don't know. I see that.
Yeah. Any other ideas? So you're on the right track, Brittany, that there is what I am going to argue, and what Durkheim argues, is that the society, or even like mini societies, like little, like social groups like the Chicago Bears, function as religious organizations, as like religions. They are inherently religious, and he's going to go to argue that um, there is no difference between society and a religion. That a religion is, in fact, the worshiping of society. Durkheim is an atheist. So we'll just cover that part already. So I challenged my intro to sociology class today. I said, my goal today is to show you that the Chicago Bears are just as religious as Catholicism. And so let's see if that's possible here too. So, what constitutes a religion? He says that the first thing is that religions delineate between the sacred and the profane. So, the sacred things are those which the interdictions protect and isolate. What he's trying to say is the sacred are things that are too important or divine to touch or destroy. So we can think of, if you are Christian or Jewish, the idea of the Ark of the Covenant. This was something you weren't even supposed to touch. There's a story in the Bible where the people who were, carrying the Ark of the Covenant on sticks, the ark started to fall, and one of them lifted his hand to touch the Ark of the Covenant and push it back up and make sure it didn't fall. Even him touching it, God struck him down with lightning because it was so sacred that no human could touch the ark. Now, in society, there aren't things that will like strike you down if you touch them all the time, but there are things that are so sacred that we shouldn't desecrate or touch. Things like the American flag, right? In the US, that is, we're not supposed to burn it. It's seen as super disrespectful. We saw how many people reacted to the tearing down of various statues. So those could be considered sacred. We see January 6th. You probably heard a lot of the congressmen and women saying these hallowed halls have been desecrated, or they have ruined the sanctity of Congress, right? So the Capitol building itself was seen as something sacred. The profane is simply those things which are either mundane, so like, tying my shoes, that's not a sacred act, or things to remain at a distance. So whether that's sin, whether that's something dirty or disgusting, stay away from it. So those are the two poles that religion tries to separate, is what is sacred and what is profane. And this includes both, beliefs, practices, and values. So it's more than just actions or objects, but also what do you believe? What do you think? Second, after a religion has delineated between sacred and profane, they create practices and rituals to reaffirm that. So rites are the rules of conduct which prescribe how a man should comport himself in the presence of the sacred object. My professor, when I was an undergrad, gave the example of a scene in Indiana Jones, if you've seen it, where Indiana Jones has stolen a skull, and when this indigenous tribe is coming to attack him, he holds up the skull and they all immediately bow down because they have learned how to comport themselves in the presence of sacred objects. So whenever they were around that skull, they would bow down and give deference. So that is a rite or a ritual. And then finally, this religious community is defined in some way. He says that it's defined as a church But in society, we would give it another name, and name would depend on the kind of group it is. So whether that's the Chicago fan base for the Bears, or a cult group, or people who love Beyonce, could be the Bays. They've got a defined group of people who have a delineation between the sacred and profane. Queen Bey, she is the premier artist, and she should have won the Grammy that Adele stole. So that is the sacred and profane. They have common practices and rituals, like singing to her music, dancing to it, going to concerts, and they have defined themselves as the Bays. So this is what constitutes a religion for Durkheim. How does religion start? First, as people come together, as we've talked about, they create collective representations. This is how social facts start. Remember, we talked about crystallization. But also, when we get together, there is this thing called collective effervescence. I'm going to read a quote from not Division of Labor, from the Elementary Forms, and then I'll try to explain it. So he writes, "In fact, we have seen that if collective life awakens religious thought on reaching a certain degree of intensity, it is because it brings about a state of effervescence which changes the conditions of psychological activity. Energies are overexcited, passions more active, sensations are stronger, and there are even some which are produced only at this moment." So he's saying that the foundation of religious life is when we come together, there are moments when this energy just is palpable between people. And you can think of whether it was a religious ceremony or a concert or a sports game, where you just kind of felt so excited and so enthralled with everyone around you and what was going on that you could not just help but scream and yell and applaud or jump up and down or whatever it is. And he's saying this is collective effervescence. This is a vital energy that is just awaking in us a extreme connection to the collective group, right? And that is essentially how society starts, is through these collective expressions. And we love this feeling, this effervescence, this collective communalism, that we assign it to totems. So the next part of a religion is the totem. This is an outward, invisible form of the religious fervor or the religious energy. We assign it to this totem as a sign of our deity. So when we experience this religious fervor, whether it be a devotion to God or a excitement over the Bears scoring a touchdown, we kind of trap this fervor and this belief and this energy into a symbol to remind us of this wonderful feeling and this connection to the group. So whether that is the American flag, whether it is the Chicago Bears mascot, whether it is the Christian cross or the Jewish Star of David, we, as human beings, use symbols to embody the collective effervescence, this energy that we create when we come together as groups. Then we reaffirm that energy through our rites and rituals. We create systems and events to reignite that energy, to continue creating the energy, and to remind us about the energy, right? And so religion provides us the time to both remember the energy through the symbol and the opportunity to re-energize ourselves, I guess I would say, through the rites and rituals. When I looked up rites, this was the only icon that I could get that was not satanic worship, which was funny. So be careful when you search for that term in Google Images. So I wrote up at the top, collective representation of God or society, because Durkheim believes that what we are worshiping, even if it is a religious institution like a church, what they are really worshiping is just society. So let me read this quote again from the Elementary Forms. The symbol of the determined society is its flag. It is the sign by which each clan distinguishes itself from the others, the visible mark of its personality, a mark borne by everything which is a part of the clan under any title whatsoever, men, beasts, or things. So like your totem or your flag could be a turtle, or it could be a tree, or it could be, a bear. So if it is at once the symbol of the God and of the society, is that not because the God and society are only one? The God of the clan can therefore be nothing else than the clan itself, personified and represented to the imagination under the visible form of the totem. So he's saying that we take this totem, which we've imbued with this social energy, and we've created that totem based on that energy, and we worship that totem because of that energy. And while we as humans have named that thing God that we worship, in reality, what Durkheim is saying is we are just worshiping these social feelings that come out of coming together and being part of a collective group. Does that make sense? Everything that we talked about in terms of what constitutes a religion, how religions are created, and also why Durkheim believes that what we are worshiping is society and is not God. Is there any questions or things you want me to repeat there?
No.
I will say, as a religious person myself, when I first heard this, I was a little put off, and I was like, had a little bit of a crisis of faith. If you're religious and want to talk about this and how it works with faith, love to do that. Sign up for office hours or let me know when you want to meet, because I've got a lot of thoughts on how this actually works within a believing in the divine, yet accepting social facts. I love to talk about that, but we don't got time today. So
Yes,
let's
it's
go into
just
what's that?
sorry. No, I was just gonna say that I agree with you. It's interesting stuff. It really is, you know.
Mm-hmm. And so when I asked at the end of the class, I was like, because we talked about how the Chicago Bears have the sacred and profane. They have practices and rituals. They have a church. You go to Soldier Field, you are in the church. And at the end of the class, I was like, so did I win? Did I convince you that the Chicago Bears are the same as Catholicism? And one of the students who's very religious was like, I wouldn't say that you convinced me, but you provided a very strong and interesting argument. So
Yes.
he's like, I will have to think about this later. But it's important to know, even if you might look at it this way, even if um, we act religiously, that doesn't mean that those religious actions don't have even more meaning, or that they don't have even more. And but I would offer that I do agree with Durkheim that we do act religiously in a lot of ways, right? We worship to some extent money and capitalism, the flag in the United States. Even in our jobs, there are things that are sacred and profane that we need to watch out for, otherwise we might get fired. So I would impress upon you, even though we're talking about this in terms of religion, that to think about it in a way that what is our religious like actions, and then if you're still concerned about the religious part and how that meshes and how you can believe and still accept this, feel free to let me know. So, society and the individual. I am giving you the quote that tells you exactly how Durkheim believes what human nature is. So you should be able to just pull this right in and throw it into your study guide or study group document. Human nature in itself cannot set variable limits to our needs. When the individual is left alone, these needs are unlimited. And without reference to any external regulation, our capacity for sensation is a bottomless abyss that nothing can satisfy. So he's saying that humans inherently have this need for more, that we have appetites, that we have desires that never end unless something outside of us puts some regulation or some, block on that. And he says that society's purpose is to moderate those desires, those inclinations, either directly and as a whole or through the agency of one of its organs. Society is the only moral power superior to the individual whose authority he accepts. So society provides the norms, the social facts that curb our desires and tell us what is or is not appropriate for us to work for. Now, this gets a little dicey because this is where a lot of his racism and classism comes in, because he says that you shouldn't want more than society has dictated you to want. So you should be happy with the status, that you have occupied. It gets not great. But let's step back from that and think, and you can disagree with this, is it right that if you had no norms telling you how to act, how to be, would you infinitely desire, or is human nature something else? And what he sees at the interplay of society and the individual is that individuals have the creativity to keep society evolving, whereas society is the buffer to keep individuals from wanting so much that they just commit suicide. It's just too much for them. They can't handle it. And in general, suicide is the disruption or imbalance between these two forces, between the individual and society. There are two dynamics at work here. There's the level of social integration. So again, we want to balance at how enmeshed the individual is to society. And there's social regulation, where we want a balance between the rules and norms an individual has to follow. And here's the two kind of frames. When you have too little social integration, when the person is not connected to society enough, when they are home alone most of the time or don't have friends, then they are prone to an egoistic suicide where they feel no reason to be here, no connection to the rest of the world, that they cut themselves off completely. On the flip side, he says you can have too much social integration where you are so dedicated and so integrated into society that you will perform actions that are dangerous to yourself and possibly suicidal. One example of this, if you watched Captain America, there's the example of when he just joins the military and one of his commanders throws a grenade into the pit, and Captain America jumps on the grenade and is prepared to sacrifice himself to make sure no one else in the military dies. He has given himself over to society so much, he's lost his own individualism, that he is willing to sacrifice himself for the military. That would be altruistic suicide. The loss of individuality such that it does not matter if I die, as long as the group continues. Now, on the social regulation balance, if you have too little social regulation, meaning, and this is where we get to this part, where human nature is a infinite desire and society regulates that. If you do not have enough regulation to explain to you how to act in what's proper, what your desires should and could be, then people will commit suicide. One of the greatest examples of this, in my opinion, is people who win the lottery have a really high rate of suicide, even though that is a increase in their, in their wealth and in their standings. However, it launches them into a different class of society where there are different norms, there's different rules, there's different tax codes, there's different people, there's different, clothes, there's different attitudes, there's different beliefs, such that many of them just can't handle the stress of all the new ways of thinking, acting, and believing, and it becomes too much. So even in positive movements where you drastically improve your social standing, if the regulation is too disrupted or confusing, Durkheim argues that you have too little social regulation and you are prone to anomic suicide. Now, on the other hand, he doesn't talk about this much. It's more of an afterthought, partly because he's looking at moments of suicide when people have choice, and when you have too much social regulation, that takes away a lot of your choice. And he calls this fatalistic suicide. We can think of an example of someone who is a prisoner of war and has been, they are told when to eat, how to eat, etc., and they end up committing suicide in order to just end the pressure of always being completely controlled. That would be an example of fatalistic suicide. Durkheim, in another piece, argues that that's not really suicide because they didn't have much options anyway. So he kind of ignores that to the most and focuses a lot on anomic suicide. Before we delve into anomy a lot more, are there any questions on these different realms of integration and regulation and how the connection between the individual and society matters? Is there any question on that?
Professor, is Durkheim talking about literal suicide?
Yeah.
Or is he talking about, I'm sorry, what'd you say?
I said yes, literal suicide.
Okay, so I disagree.
Okay. So with all of it, or so we're only reading a section, and unfortunately we're not reading the empirical section. He goes through the data of European suicide counts, and he finds that suicides are more likely to occur for people who are Catholic than Protestant. No, people who are Protestant than Catholic. Suicides are more common in Protestant religions than they are in Catholic religions. Suicides are more common in men than they are in women. Suicides are more common in people who work in trade and merchants than people who work in, poorer jobs. And his reasoning is, for most of these, is that there is either too little or too much integration or regulation. So, for example, Catholicism versus Protestantism. And this was back then in Europe. So Protestantism in the US might look a little different, but Catholicism was a much more communal religion. Protestantism really emphasized your individual salvation, that you yourself would need to work out your salvation, whereas Catholicism was much more mystical, between the group and the community salvation. And so he said that there was too little integration for Protestants with their social community, that it was more common for them to commit suicide. Um, for men and women, he argued, tend to have a broader social group and more connections to the people in their group, whereas men tended to be more individual and alone, which led to more suicides among men. The the jobs that worked in economics and trade, there was too many changes in the economy, that they were constantly trying to figure out new social norms and ways of doing business, that suicide rates were higher in those professions than in professions that tended to be more stable, yet more poor. So, janitorial work, or laying bricks, or building, or seamstresses. Those were, they might have less pay, but there was more consistency and more connection to the rules and norms of those positions, so that people who worked in the economic sphere were more likely to commit suicide. So this isn't to say that the second you stop, like if you cut off ties with all of your friends, you're suddenly going to commit suicide. However, he's trying to show that there are social influences in suicide. And this is actually what he presented to the National Academy of the Sciences, to argue that social facts were a thing. Because if suicide was purely psychological, we would find no patterns between societies, right? It would just be random if it was purely psychological. But because we see patterns of men versus women, Catholics versus Protestants, industrialized countries versus non-industrialized countries, then there's clearly social influences into why or how people commit suicide. Does that make sense?
It does. The social regulation part and the fatalistic suicide. I'm thinking, of course, around the time he wrote these things,
Mm-hmm.
and understanding, particularly, again, knowing that he was talking mainly around Europe, about Europe, right? But I understand that during that same time, you were dealing with the abolition of slavery and all these different things, and there was tremendous amount of social regulation on Black people and their bodies,
Mm-hmm.
and yet I've not seen numbers that would suggest that they literally committed suicide, but I can see where they took some fatalistic actions that might,
Yeah.
you know what I mean?
And
So,
this is again where Durkheim has some myopic visions, in that he doesn't address issues of slavery and colonialism.
yeah,
And so it'd be interesting if the other three areas of suicide hold true. If the low amounts of social regulation, or low amounts of integration, or high amounts of integration lead people to commit suicide, why doesn't too much regulation lead to suicide? That would be an interesting course of study. Um,
okay.
and but I don't I agree. I don't know the I think slavery is probably the best example of something that is society wide, right? Rather than like a prisoner of war, which is very hard to study. And so if that's the case, that suicide rates didn't increase in enslaved communities, what does that mean for this theory? Is there something about too much regulation that doesn't quite fit? Or does this put into doubt everything he's saying here? And I think that's a worthwhile question.
Okay.
Um,
Thank you.
yeah, but let's focus on anomie, and this is our last slide. Um, So anomie is his idea that of kind of chaos, and I would argue within the last 3 years we have, or maybe even the last like 7 years, we have faced an endless anomie. It's never finished. But it is the disturbance of the collective order. So, as he says, it takes time for men and women and things to be reclassified by the public consciousness. So, this is after a disruption event, whether it's war, whether it's an economic shock, that it takes time for men and things to be reclassified. As long as these liberated social forces have not regained their equilibrium, their respective values remain undetermined, and therefore regulation is lacking. One no longer knows what is fair, what are legitimate claims and hopes, and which are excessive. The state of deregulation, or anomie, is therefore further heightened by the fact that passions are less disciplined at the very moment when they need stronger discipline. So we see here again thinking in terms of regulation and how is society tempering our passions and our desires and our wants. And if we are in some kind of collective disturbance, then what happens to those wants, claims? I personally disagree with his notion of what it is to be human, but I do think he's onto something, that there is a balancing act between the individual and society. I'm not sure what that is yet, but please know that for Durkheim, what he sees as inherently human is this inability to bridle one's passions to the point that society needs to step in and regulate it to make sure that no one kind of goes off the wall. Any questions about anomie or this, the parts on the individual and society? Well, that is it for Durkheim. If you have more questions, feel free to let me know. I'm open for office hours, or if you need other times, just let me know. I'm happy to meet up.
Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good night, guys.
Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Professor, I will stop by to see you tomorrow.
Okay, perfect. Not Wednesday, Thursday.
You're there.